Hey everybody, today by popular demand we are talking about 602 recommendations from Hendron Racing Engines. And if you're not familiar with Hendron Racing Engines, they are the biggest crate engine rebuilder in the country. So they work on a lot of these engines and they know they have a lot of great things to say. So let's go ahead and kick it off and talk about ignition. And they recommend running 34 degrees of engine timing set at 4,000 RPM with a locked out distributor. If you try to boost your timing more than that, you will lose significant power when timed above the 34 degrees. Now with that ignition system, before running your engine, check and make sure that your magnetic pickup wires from your distributor are completely isolated from any other ignition source that carries amperage. The mag pickup wires coming from your ignition box to your distributor must be run completely separately from any other wires. And make sure the entire length of your mag pickup wires are run separate and they do not cross over any other source of amperage. And a distance of 1 inch is plenty enough. Now, if you're using an HEI distributor, which many of you do in 602s, they recommend locking out the advanced curve as well. You must also have a minimum of number 10 wire as a positive power supply. They suggest using aftermarket modules and coils if it's legal to do so in your division. Now, for spark plug wires, they say these are often overlooked by many racers. And when it comes to getting maximum performance from your engine, they recommend replacing all your spark plug wires and your coil wire if you're using a coil wire after each race season. The two best wires they found would be the Moroso Ultra 40s. I don't sell those at Crate Insider, but we do sell the Fast Firewire. Both of these wires have the least amount of resistance when compared to other spark plug wires on the market. Now, when we're talking about RPMs, back with ignition, they recommend using a 6400 RPM Rev Limiter Chip. The 602 engines will go into valve float over 6400 RPM, and that will cause premature valve train wear and failure. And they found that most of the crate engine failures that they've seen are a direct result of having the RPMs way too high. So definitely keep your RPMs in check. They also say that if you've got a buddy running next to you that says he's running a 6500 chip or that something like that, it's really a load of crap is what they say. So if somebody's telling you that, then either their tach is wrong or they will soon be running through their engine parts, or you need to protest them because they're running aftermarket valve springs. And like I said, most of the failures that they see are all due to RPMs being out of line. Now, they also mention with the tachs, they see a lot of these that read wrong, especially the Tel-Tacs and other similar brands. And so they recommend calibrating your tach and your rev limiter on a chassis dyno if that's available in your area. Now, when it comes to engine oil, let me grab a couple of these for you. They recommend 2 oils for you to use. One of them would be the Schaefer 709. This is a 1030 oil, and the other would be the Klotz 1040. Now the Klotz is the highest performing oil that they've found, but the Schaefer's is also a very excellent oil. They recommend changing your oil after every 100 racing laps minimum, and they recommend doing this even more often if you're going to be in a dusty environment, because remember, fresh oil is the best oil. Now with an additive, let me get that additive for you. Our Daytona 1 XL1 engine treatment here is an additive they've found that works great with any number of oils. Now you don't need to use it if you're running the Klotz oil, but with any other oil, go ahead and use the Daytona 1 XL1 engine treatment. They found that on their own house car, that is a 604, but they found when they put this in, that was the only change they made. They gained 8 horsepower and 12 foot-pounds of torque by simply pouring the additive in the engine. So they highly suggest using the product. Just as a side note, make sure that your engine is broken in completely and that the rings are seated before you try to use actually either the Klotz oil or that additive. Next up, let's talk about oil filters. And the oil filter they recommend is the Wix 51061R, or if you're in a Crate Sportsman and you need the short style of oil filter, they recommend going with the 5106 9R, and it is the exact same filter. It's just a slightly shorter version of that, but the Wix oil filter is the oil filter they recommend. For spark plugs, they recommend either the NGK R5724-8 or the AC Delco MR43 LTSs, and I sell the NGKs. I do not carry the AC Delcos. Either way, you want to gap those at 40 thousandths when using an MSD type ignition system, or you'll gap it at 35 thousandths when using HEIs. And they recommend changing your spark plugs after every 10 races for maximum performance. Now, when it comes to carburetors, they recommend using either Willys carbs or David Smith carbs. Now, if you are a Hendren customer, they make their own carburetors as well, so that is an option if they're doing some work for you. Otherwise, either the Willys or David Smith is a very excellent option. And they also recommend Willys Super Bowl setup. Regardless of the type of carburetor, you can put that on any of them as long as they have a Holley style design. And the Super Bowl, it eliminates so many problems. They say 99.999% of the problems that they see, because with this Willys Super Bowl system, it eliminates the needle in seat. And we have a video on our YouTube channel that talks about the Willys Super Bowl system. You're welcome to look that up. For headers, it really is going to depend on your car, is really a big factor here. If you have a late model, they recommend using the Dynatec headers, and use those in conjunction with the anti-reversion mufflers that Hendren helped design. They actually designed them, and then Dynatec now produces them. For my guys who run an IMCA Modifieds, the Sport Mods, we recommend going with the BA headers. They found that they're really the best fit that we found for a header for Modifieds, and they also have excellent performance. Now, when it comes to the stock front clip cars, he says that they don't have a particular header recommendation for these because they usually race under rules that require a spec header. And they do suggest, however, if your rules allow for it, that you use stepped headers with a 3-inch collector and as close to equal length primary tubes as possible, and then use this in conjunction with their anti-reversion mufflers. So those are some tips on using headers. Now, for a carb spacer, we recommend going with the HVH. This is the ST4150-2AL. We call this the 1-inch spacer for a dual intake manifold, dual plane intake manifold, and this is the spacer we recommend. Now, if your rules will allow for it. If your rules don't allow this spacer, then they recommend using the tallest spacer that your rules will allow for. And then in their testing, they've seen very little difference between a 4-hole or an open, and it's just the overall height seems to make the most difference. Now, when it comes to your water pump pulleys and your fan blades, they recommend for the water pumps and pulleys to use any of the Jones Racing products or the KRC front drive kits along with their recommended water pumps. The Jones Racing products and KRC systems are the best, most affordable, and the lightest weight that they've found. They seem to draw the least amount of power from the engine. Now, when it comes to fans, they recommend using the smallest engine fan that you can get away with. They prefer to use a 2-blade fan, or they also recommend going with a race fan. If you haven't seen it, it's an aluminum hub with composite blades, and they would recommend using that with either 2 or 3 blades. Now, that is a 19-inch fan, so I know that a lot of my modified customers that may be too big of a fan as far as the diameter goes. But it is extremely lightweight, and it utilizes those, replaceable blades, which is really nice. And then next up, let's talk about air filters and air filter bases. Currently, they previously recommended the R2C filters, which was a non-oiled filter, and since none of us can get those anymore, and R2C has basically gone out of business, we now recommend going with the Walker oil filter, and it is the Walker air filter. It is an oiled filter, but we've seen excellent performance. As far as a base, they recommend going with the CrateInsider flat air filter base. And if you've watched any of my Top 5 Tuesday videos, this is April right now. These have been featured nearly every week, and we sell this with we've got the base, and then we sell it with this seal that you can just silicone on there, and to get a nice tight seal between your carburetor and your air filter. That's our CrateInsider flat air filter base. By the way, they do not recommend using the All-Star Performance air filter. They've had several engines in the past few years that they say have practically bored themselves from the amount of dirt those filters let into the engine. Now let's talk about valve springs. Hendron recommends that you check your valve springs after every race and inspect the rocker arms, the valve keepers, and the retainers for any signs of excessive wear. They recommend that you keep a logbook on your valve springs for quick reference when you're testing your seat pressures. And they recommend changing any valve spring that has lost 5 pounds of seat pressure. Now, in order to get your springs, they recommend purchasing several boxes from me or GM, or just getting regular GM springs, getting several of them and then testing them. We use this bench tester here from Longacre. And that way you'll be able to find the best springs available. And if that's something you don't want to do, here at Crate Insider, we do sell matched sets of 602 valve springs. Now, this is right in line with the #1 question that they get almost daily, is one that they can't answer. And that question is, what should my valve springs check at? Well, the big answer is they don't know. And here is why they don't know. Because on every on-the-car valve spring tester is going to check differently, especially from brand to brand. And they also check differently from one guy to the next, or one person to the next. In other words, if I pull on a valve spring pressure tester on the car, I'm going to get a different number than you're going to get. They don't own and they don't use an on-the-car valve spring tester. Instead, they use a precision benchtop valve spring tester, because that way you know exactly what the springs will check when you've got a precision benchtop tester. So when you get your engine and it has brand new springs on it, check each spring with your on-the-car tester. You want to log each of those springs on your log and base your future readings off of that. And make sure the same person checks those springs each week, since we mentioned before that reading is going to be different from person to person. Now, let's move on to valve adjustment. When you adjust your valves, they actually have a whole procedure right here, and I have this entire document so you guys can download it. You'll just click the link. There'll be a link on YouTube. You'll see a link down below. On Facebook, it might be a button, or it might be in the description on the top. But they've got a whole section here talking about valve adjustment. Now let's talk about fuel. They recommend only using race gas rather than using pump gas. Regular pump gas is way too unpredictable, and especially when it comes to ethanol content. And since the federal government has allowed oil companies to cut their fuel with up to 10% ethanol, they've seen serious performance issues with engines running regular pump gas, as well as some engine failures. Now, here would be the fuels that they would recommend for your engine. For a regular race gas that's non-oxygenated, you could use any race gas that is between 95 and 105 octane. Out of all of those, they recommend the Impact Sport Plus 102 octane that is blended by Lone Star Super Gas Incorporated in Texas, if you can get that. And otherwise, you can also use any non-oxygenated fuel with an octane rating less than 104 and more than 91. For the oxygenated race gas, if you were going in that direction, they recommend the Klotz CR604, and that is a fuel that Hendren worked directly with Klotz to help develop, and it is a fuel that I sell here at Crate Insider. It currently produces the most power and torque out of any of the highly oxygenated race gases on the market, and it also happens to be the most stable of the oxygenated fuels that are out there, and does not contain any of the banned chemicals that Neesmith does not allow. So it is 100% Neesmith legal. Another option would be the VP Crate Horsepower, or CHP, and they would consider that probably the most practical option in most areas of the country. However, with the VP, you will need to make some carburetor modifications in order to run it properly. And it's not always legal to use depending on the series or the track that you run. It is a very good fuel and recommended as an alternative if it's legal. Now, when it comes to the Rush Racing series, the Hendren recommends their 91 octane spec fuel. And then naturally, if you can run methanol, run methanol. Methanol will produce the most power and torque of any fuel currently available, but there are so many places where you cannot run that fuel. And then regardless of the fuel, they highly recommend running a bypass fuel system with any and all racing fuels. Now, moving on from that, with the fuel, we also recommend you install an on-off valve in line with from your fuel cell to your engine. They've actually seen several engine failures due to the fuel cell siphoning into the engine, either filling the oil pan with fuel and causing bearing failure, or filling cylinders with fuel and causing engines to hydraulic. Now, with all this, let's move on to cold air. We always want to try to get the coldest air possible into the engine for the best performance. So with a cold air box, they recommend that you isolate your air cleaner from underhood heat. And it is best to seal the air cleaner base to the hood in order to only breathe outside air temperature. Because otherwise, for every 100 degrees of air inlet temperature that is gained over the outside air temp, you will lose 10% of the engine's power. So ensuring that your engine is only breathing outside air is critical on these Crate engines. And now you can make your own cold air box, or you can get one that's pre-made. If you see the black, yeah, right there on the camera, you can see the black cold air boxes right there that we sell lots of. If those are legal, I know in many areas of the country those aren't legal for like the 602 Sport Mods. Now let's talk about thermostats. Hendren does not recommend using a thermostat in the cooling system. They've seen far too many engine killing issues with thermostats. This includes thermostats that are meant for racing. And if you have issues getting your engine warm enough under racing conditions, switch to a smaller fan blade or block off part of your radiator, and that'll help raise your temperatures. Now, before racing, they recommend that you warm up your engine before any type of high RPM racing or practicing. Now, let's talk about priming your oil system for a moment. If you're buying your engine and like straight from GM and it's not, the oil system is not primed, you will need to prime your oil system before starting your engine for the first time. Now, even though it was assembled with assembly lube, this is not enough to ensure against damage or startup if your engine has not been primed. So priming an engine does not mean turning the engine over with a starter until it gets oil pressure. To prime your engine properly, pull both of the valve covers off of your engine. Use an engine priming tool and prime the oil system until you have oil coming out of each of the rocker arms spit holes. Now you can turn the engine 1/4 revolution by hand every few minutes as you are priming the oil system, but be patient. It will take an average of 10 to 20 minutes of priming in order to get oil to all 16 of the rocker arms. Once the engine oil system has been primed, reinstall the valve covers and torque the valve cover bolts to 100 inch-pounds. So there we have it. We have our 602 recommendations from Hendron Racing Engines. I hope you enjoyed this video. To download this sheet, click on the link, and that way it will be delivered directly over to your email. And thank you so much for watching. On YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. And if you like this video, push the like button. And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.